in kind of an official capacity, I just want to introduce Jessie Bailey. She is going to serve as our chair today from the Office of Data Governance and Analytics. So she is a new member for us, but is going to be facilitating us through the voting process today. So Jessie, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say thank you for having me. I'm filling in for Ken File and Marcus Thornton from the Office of Data Governance and Analytics today. So happy to be here, happy to have you all here. I know Carolyn let me know that this is the last subcommittee meeting before you all present your recommendations to the overall group. So it's really cool to be here and see how that's working. With that, if everyone's ready, let's call the meeting to order. Alrighty. So first we'll be starting with the roll call. So I do believe I'm passing that to Carolyn for that.
Yep,
Or
I'll take it.
Wheeler. Apologies.
I'll take it.
Okay.
Oh no, it's quite fine. So I'm just going to go and mark you down as here for the Office of Data Governance and Analytics. And so from the Accomack Northampton Planning District Commission, Ann Doyle.
Present.
Good morning.
Good morning.
From the American Flood Coalition, I believe we have Katie Malone or Jack Polakowski.
Yes, present.
Thank you. Crater Planning District Commission, Jay Ellington, Andrew Transition, or Kit Friedman.
Present.
Present.
So I have Andrew and Kit. Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, Ben McFarland or Whitney Catchmark.
Present.
Good morning. Northern Neck Planning District Commission, Brianna Heath. Plan RVA, Sarah Stewart or Eli Podema.
Present.
Excuse me. Sorry about that. Virginia Department of Transportation, Chris Swanson or Christopher Berg. Virginia Marine Resource Commission, Rachel Peabody. Virginia Port Authority, Scott Whitehurst.
Here.
Good morning. Wetlands Watch, Mary Carson Stiff or Ian Blair.
Ian, present.
Good morning. William and Mary Virginia Coastal Resilience Collaborative, Thomas Rupert.
Present.
Good morning. The roll has been called.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
All right. The next couple of things on our list are the adoption of the agenda for this meeting and then the adoption of the previous meeting minutes. So are we going to the next slide here?
We'll stay here for the adoption of the agenda. This is the agenda before the subcommittee for consideration. And
understood.
you can go ahead. Yep, and call the vote.
Understood. So we'll do a voice vote for the adoption of the agenda. So can I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
Motion to adopt the meeting agenda.
All right, and may I have a second?
Second.
All righty, all in favor, say yay.
Yay.
All opposed?
Yay.
I apologize. Is it yay?
It's yay or aye. That's fine.
I like yay better though.
Okay, we'll use yay for this meeting. Yay/aye. All right, all opposed say nay. All righty, agenda has been adopted. All right, moving on to our previous meeting minutes. We'll go through the same thing. So can I have a motion to adopt the previous meeting minutes?
So moved.
Okay, may I have a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor, please say yay or aye.
Aye.
Yay.
Yay.
All opposed say nay. All righty, looks like we are adopting the previous meeting minutes, and now I'll pass it to Carolyn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for being here for our final meeting. I'm really excited to get to this point in the process. As you've seen on the agenda in front of you, what we'll be doing today is kind of a brief reminders about what we're doing, why we're here, some updates on the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 2, and then we're going to spend the vast majority of the time during today's extended meeting discussing recommendations development and then voting on our subcommittee recommendations. I do want to flag that this agenda deviates a little bit from previous agendas in that we have moved up public comment to occur prior to voting. So we will be pausing after our recommendations development discussion to move into public comment. We have up to 20 minutes held for that, and we'll see if we have any members of the public who wish to make comments, and then we will go into voting after the public comment has concluded. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get into the subcommittee overview. So just as a reminder, the Coastal Resilience Master Plan is this document. It's a trusted resource to assist government entities in making better decisions about mitigating severe and repetitive flooding in coastal Virginia. Our coastal Virginia region is defined by the 8 easternmost planning district commissions in the Commonwealth, as you see on the map in the right side of your screen. This document will provide a unified baseline analysis of the threat of increasing flood exposure and impacts due to sea level rise and changing precipitation patterns. It will also identify opportunities to prioritize resilience solutions. And one of the major ways that we're doing that is by kind of updating our inventory of projects and initiatives that are underway or planned across the coastal region. This plan, the phase 2 plan, is due in December. So we're working hard on finishing up and getting all the pieces together now, and we'll include the kind of information about what is exposed to flooding, what sort of assets are exposed and what that means in terms of impacts. Those planned resilience actions are the projects and initiatives, financial needs for flood resilience, and of course the subcommittee recommendations. This project prioritization subcommittee has been working toward 3 major objectives since coming together as a body. So firstly, informing and supporting the hazard portion of the plan, so the hazard risk assessment. So looking at data inputs and how we're quantifying vulnerability, as well as the impact assessment outputs. And then secondly, supporting the identification of those projects and initiatives and other opportunities to appear in the plan. Finally, last but not least, the recommendations development has been the focus of the past several meetings, and we've been working towards, we've got our 5 priority recommendations we'll discuss in just a minute, but the original idea for those recommendations are shown on the screen here, identifying goals and associated metrics for resilience that could help with needs evaluation and prioritization, and then objective protocols for evaluating and prioritizing project needs. And lastly, protocols for evaluating and prioritizing resilience actions. This is our overall subcommittee schedule. We are at our final meeting. As I've said, we'll be working towards our final recommendations. And before we dive into the recommendations development, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to share updates on the impact assessment and the planned resilience action side of things to let you know how things are going. This timeline should look familiar to many of you. We are currently in this final box phase of final product design and delivery, really working on communicating the key data and stories to appear in the plan, as well as in the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer, which we are working on updating. So this has been a collaborative process with both our contractors at Dewberry and our contractors at Stantec to develop the kind of hazard exposure and impacts information that we're working on now. I have just a couple of slides to share here. These are slides that we shared at the public webinars that we hosted back in September, which were kind of an interim point in the process to share with the public what we're working on with the plan and kind of generate interest and awareness of the plan prior to its release in December. So these are some of the very high level findings that were communicated, where we don't have kind of the maps and graphics here, but we are developing those similar maps to what you'll see in phase 1, as well as other, more visual graphs and charts and things to communicate information. So this is fairly text heavy. I'm not going to read it all, but I did want to share it, and we will be distributing these slides after the meeting so you can take a look in a little bit more detail. But we are reporting on kind of the increases, as you can see, in all 3 types of the increases in coastal and rainfall-driven flooding and the current condition of riverine flooding, as this plan does not include future-looking forecasts for riverine flooding. So across all of the kind of 5 planning scenarios that we're looking at, from baseline, which is meant to represent present-day conditions, out through the far future high scenario, which is meant to represent a more conservative view of what the end of the century could look like for flooding across the coastal region. We also presented at that same public webinar information about the impacts assessment. So this shows some of the key takeaways across our different asset categories. Thinking back several meetings back in the past now, we had extensive discussions about those different kind of themes and asset categories and the impact assessment data that would go into the actual kind of quantification of assets behind the findings. So this is showcasing some of those final results of intersecting that asset data with the flood hazard data that was generated to get these findings. Again, I recognize this is pretty dense. We're working on maps and graphics and things like that, but this highlights some of our findings. One of the key takeaways here is, of course, as probably we would all expect, Hampton Roads is among the most exposed in terms of coastal flooding, in terms of population exposure, and rainfall-driven flooding is most pronounced in the Northern Virginia region. And then we've also got some takeaways here for buildings and roads, kind of total road length exposure, and then natural infrastructure. So looking at the types of land cover that are exposed to flooding. And on this last piece on natural infrastructure, the plan will primarily focus on looking at loss of natural infrastructure and quantifying that amount in acreage to kind of permanent inundation, as well as the dollar values associated with that from FEMA's BCA calculator. And I believe we discussed that in our previous meetings. Before I move on to plan resilience actions, I want to see if there's any questions or comments about the status of the impact assessment portion of the plan. Okay, great. So plan resilience actions analysis is also in this final stage of producing the summary information, both in terms of that final report PDF as well as the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. We have contracted with Dewberry. They're now working on updating that Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. We do have kind of a mock-up in there working on delivering on that now. So again, I just have one quick slide or two quick slides to share some of the information that was reported out at that public webinar last month. So we're summarizing projects and initiatives and our findings from the database across each planning district commission in terms of the number of total projects and initiatives, but also in terms of project and initiative cost. We recognize that there is a lot of variation in the size of different projects and initiatives. Some may have multiple different project sites, for example, and be reported as a single project, while others may be relatively small, just a single stormwater infrastructure improvement or something like that. So using both that cost and quantity or number data to try to show the variation across the region, as well as the different types of hazards addressed by those projects and initiatives. So key takeaway here is that the vast majority of projects in the Web Explorer are focused on addressing stormwater flooding. And of those, and across most categories except for shoreline erosion, the vast majority of projects are or more than half of projects, I should say, are structural projects. The exception there is the shoreline erosion. We do have quite a lot of living shorelines in the projects and initiatives inventory. We are also presenting examples of projects and initiatives throughout the plan with small case studies. This is just a couple of examples of projects and initiatives, one project on the left and one initiative on the right that do appear as part of that Web Explorer inventory. So there's a wide variety of different actions. We do have quite a few actions in the Web Explorer that are focused on reducing exposure to flooding through kind of real-time flood monitoring and roadway monitoring in particular. So this sort of gate system or notification system around preventing folks from driving through flooded roadways is one that we see across various different PDC regions in the plan. And then I think many folks are familiar with the Resilience Adaptation Feasibility Tool, or the RAFT. This process also appears in the plan. And that is all I have in terms of updates on the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. From here, we will move into recommendations development. Before I do so, are there any questions, comments on the status of development of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 2? Okay, great. Well, with that, I'm going to quickly do a couple of reminders about the recommendations, development, purpose, and process, and then I will hand it over to the launch team who will facilitate us through the discussion today. So, as a reminder, we're working on developing in the subcommittee's opinion what are high priority recommendations to improve the mitigation of severe and repetitive flooding in Virginia's coastal region. The recommendations that we're working on developing are either actions that should be taken prior to the next time that we release the plan, so in the next 1 to 4 years or so, by various appropriate responsible actors, or recommendations for a process improvement for the DCR Office of Resilience Planning when we work on developing the next Coastal Resilience Plan 5 years from now. So you all have already pulled together 5 recommendations. Those recommendations have been discussed at prior meetings. They were also discussed at our last full TAC meeting in September. What we're working on today is finalizing kind of the wordsmithing and making sure that all subcommittee members are in agreement, or as close as we can be, to a consensus on the language before moving into voting. So what we'll do is discuss the comments from the TAC at the last meeting and any additional comments from subcommittee members as we work on finalizing those today. After today's meeting, any recommendations that are voted out of the subcommittee will be taken to the full Technical Advisory Committee at its final meeting on November 13th, at which time all members of the Technical Advisory Committee will be voting on all subcommittee recommendations. So there will be a last vote across all probably 20 recommendations at our final TAC meeting. And just as a reminder, any recommendations that have already been developed or were kind of brainstormed and identified by the subcommittee will appear in an appendix to the plan. So while those recommendations that get voted on by the full TAC at the November 13th meeting with a passing vote will appear in the body of the plan, any recommendation that was identified throughout this process will also appear in an appendix, so the ideas and concepts will not be lost. Okay, I am going to turn it over to Linda now, who's going to talk through our more particular process for today's meeting.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. So we're going to have about 20 minutes for discussion for each recommendation. And what we're going to do in that time is look through the recommendation the way it is, and also look at the purpose. We're not voting on purpose, just on recommendation, but the purpose will appear in the report. And so we'll have some time to look through, see what has changed. You have a document that was sent to you by Carolyn, and that provides you a lot of the background. It's like 1 page per recommendation. But we're also going to be screen sharing that document today to take a look at it. But if you have a copy, this is a good time to kind of pull it up so you can see it. And we're going to talk through just any changes around the text. Is there anything that, number one, you can't support? Like, no, I've got to change it to support it. Or is there anything that you want to change just to make sure it's more clear? In some way, you're improving that recommendation itself. And so we'll be going through, there's 5 recommendations. The 5th one is one that might take a little extra time. So it might not be the same number of minutes per each, right? We're just going to organically move through them until you feel like you're comfortable with how they're phrased. We're going to be changing, Sydney will be screen sharing, and we'll be changing the actual recommendations while we're screen sharing, so that whatever you're doing for discussion, you'll be able to see it on the screen and track changes. And then from there, once we're through all 5, we'll go back through them one more time very quickly, just to see if there's any other changes that have come since you've seen all 5 and worked them through. And that seemed to work out quite well in the last subcommittee meeting that we did. After that, there'll be a public comment period, and we'll open that up. And then once the public comment period is over, we're going to do the official voting process, where we will be voting on the recommendations the way you have restructured them today. And so we will be screen sharing, and we'll explain that process. We'll be using Mentimeter. You can do that with your phone, but that will come towards the end of the workshop. Okay, so with that, any questions about process? So what we're going to do first, we can go on to the next slide, and we're actually going to switch the screen share so that we're going to screen share the recommendations in a way that we can type in them.
You want to see this document first?
Yeah, so, and we're going to first give you a preview of all 5 of them. And then we'll dive in more detail in number 1. So the first one is recommendation A, and again, there's no order or importance to these in the way that they're being shown to you. But here's the first recommendation. And I'm going to just read them out loud as we go through the 5. Then we're going to come back to this first one, and we'll be looking at the sheet that gives you a lot more background about it. Take a look. So here's the first one. The DCR, Office of Resilience Planning, should incorporate scientifically sound, professionally accepted, forward-looking data into future iterations of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan for all components of flood risk, e.g. hazard, exposure, vulnerability, including not only sea level rise and precipitation frequency, but also projected growth, demographic changes, planned infrastructure improvements, and other relevant factors. Okay, so that's the first. We're going on to the second, just as a preview. State agencies should establish a sustainable and sufficient funding source to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, and should consider more directly connecting the Community Flood Preparedness Fund to the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. Okay, the third one. State agencies should coordinate efforts to develop, maintain, and enhance accessible region-wide non-sensitive data sets needed to assess flood impacts. A single agency should be identified as the convening entity and should invite participation from political subdivisions, academia, and non-governmental organizations in coordination efforts. And so those highlighted in blue are some of the changes that were suggested. The fourth one, state agencies should establish programs to engage with and support local governments and planning district commissions with an emphasis on areas identified by the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 2 as being at high flood risk and without flood resilience projects or initiatives. Involved agencies may include DCR, VDEM, and DHCD, and where appropriate, state agencies should involve regional institutions of higher education in engagement efforts. And then last but not least, the DCR Office of Resilience Planning should work with the Flood Resilience Advisory Committee to establish a coordinated framework to operationalize the Coastal Resilience Master Plan at local, regional, and state scales. The framework should be informed by data and needs assessments and should define success and set clear long-term goals to be measured on regular near-term time spans. Okay. And so with that, we're going to go back to looking at the first recommendation, recommendation A. And in doing so, you can take a look at the sheet that kind of explains the different suggestions that go with it. And let's just we're going to have an open discussion when you think about this one and see if anybody had some suggestions. Maybe some of you have thought about it before this meeting. And so we'll be able to take a look at that. Okay.
I did put the worksheet in the chat so that you've received in the chat a copy of the PDF that has comments from the TAC meeting. In case you didn't already have it pulled up, you can take a look at it there, or we can pull it up together and talk through it as well.
Okay.
I agree. For precipitation frequency, I think we also meant precipitation frequency and intensity. That happening in the Q3 full committee meeting of bringing that up.
Yeah.
Thomas, you had that same thought too, right?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Ian.
So frequency and intensity. So, and some of the notes that came up when we talked in the TAC meeting. So we were saying, does precipitation frequency include precipitation intensity, duration, and frequency?
Yeah, the whole IDF curve.
Say that again, Ian.
The whole IDF curve, intensity, duration, frequency.
So do you want to add precipitation, intensity, duration, and frequency in that order, like IDF? Is there a different way? I know there's many words, but those words can be important. So whatever you'd like to do, just let us know.
Oh, I agree. It's just IDF is what I've seen engineers use if we were moving back to engineering. I have no strong feelings on the order of these three words.
And we have 10 members today, so feel free, unmute your mics. We want to make sure we're hearing from whomever is feeling compelled to chime in. And if for some reason you just say, I agree, that's still helpful, because then the other members know that you're on the right track. And you can also say, I'm not sure that sounds good, or I disagree. Like, you don't have to wait to answer until you figured out how to redo it. Just express an opinion, and then together you can work on how you might rephrase.
Hey, Carolyn, this is Ben from HRPDC. Point of clarification, for the precipitation, the pluvial modeling that has been done so far, does that actually cover all three of those parts of the IDF curve, or is it just intensity?
That is a great question. We're using the Marissa change factors on Atlas 14 precipitation curves. I might need to double check on how that ultimately plays out in if it is really measuring all three ultimately in the product that we're producing. Yeah, let me check and I'll follow up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, including all three of those is fine. I mean, I think if we wanted to keep it simpler, we could say something like changes in precipitation patterns. I would recommend that we add some language about riverine flooding. I know that hasn't been talked about, we haven't put that into the plan yet. But I think, in light of recent events and knowing that some parts of the coastal zone do have pretty significant riverine sources of flooding, that adding that in, calling that out specifically, I think would be worth doing. I would also change, there's if you could, let me see, the projected growth and demographic changes, I'm not sure how those differ really. So what kind of growth are we talking about? And if it's population growth or population change, I think we can just say population change.
Okay, so those are two ideas there, Ben. So let's look at those one at a time, I guess. So right now it says, including not only sea level rise and precipitation frequency. Would you like it to say, including not only sea level rise, riverine flooding, what would you like it to say? And precipitation frequency? Do you want to add something there with riverine?
Linda, can I jump in for a minute?
Sure.
Because when we separate these apart, I think the key focus is that not only looking at changing flooding conditions, but also other changes that can occur. And so I don't know if we're trying to get into too much detail of those changing flooding conditions, and we can put it all in there, whether it's the coastal flooding, the riverine, or the rainfall driven flooding, but also trying to get the changes, not only growth, but also decreases, whether it's people, economic, or infrastructure, other types of changes in the environment. So I think it might be more helpful to look at it holistically to understand what we're trying to achieve with the recommendation than just focusing on one component, because I felt like might get lost in what the bigger picture was here. And to your earlier point, the IDF curves, we did look at intensity, duration, and frequency with the factors, because we looked at multiple durations and then look at the different intensities, and then those return periods are changing too. So we do go use all parts of the IDF curve.
And what we're showing you, go ahead.
Matt, just to follow up on that, the question I was getting at with, I understand that, if we have the different durations that we're modeling, like that's one thing. I guess the way I'm thinking about it, and feel free to, correct me if I'm wrong on this. We basically like shifted the curve, but we didn't actually alter the curve, so to speak. Is that correct for the IDF? So I guess the question is, with different changes to climate, and it has been a while since I've looked at the Marissa tool, does the actual kind of look of the curve, has that changed in response to, what they've been able to model, or is it more of a lateral movement, up or down or right or left?
Does anyone know the answer to that
And that
question?
we can table that one and have that as a sidebar maybe some other time. But I think, Matt, your point about separating out or talking about, I think, flood hazard and then flood risk, and maybe that's a way for us to just kind of cut down on the text for these recommendations and just say all components of flood hazard and flood risk.
Okay.
I would recommend, if we're gonna, if the idea is to look at the increase or the changes in the hazard itself, we call that out and not just include that in the parentheses there, because there are two kind of distinct kind of sets of analysis or consideration going on. One is to be able to model what we think the conditions are going to be like, and then one is going to be to model what we think the impacts of those changing conditions will be.
So your suggestion to make it shorter and big picture, are you saying then we could say for all components of flood hazard and flood risk, period? And then we could take all the rest of that with all the detailed description, and we can either delete it, or maybe if you want to keep it, we make it a separate sentence that somehow talks about those pieces. So all components of flood hazard and flood risk. Sure.
Yes, that's what I had in mind.
Okay. So Sydney's going to type in there flood hazard and flood risk and highlight the rest of it. You'll see it taken out. And let's hear from someone else. What do you think about that? Can we just leave it as flood hazard and flood risk, put a period? We can talk about other parts, but will that cover what you're wanting? I can't have
clarification for me. Isn't risk like the formula for risk, hazard plus exposure plus minus vulnerability, depending on what that is? Like, doesn't flood risk encapsulate hazard?
Yeah, the way that we talk about it, the way that we use the word risk in the plan is that it is includes the hazard and the kind of the base level of both exposure, vulnerability, and then kind of builds upon that to quantify in terms of risk, ultimately putting usually some sort of value on it. Often in the plan, we talk about risk in terms of the dollar value resulting of, losses, for example, of average annualized loss might be an example of risk. That's how we have, for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, defined it. It is kind of a sequential approach.
So you can, as you're suggesting, then you could just say of flood risk, it would include the hazard component. Would you like to do that, to just say flood risk? We'll take out the hazard part. And so far, everyone else's microphones just aren't coming off mute. So hopefully they're working for you. But let us know what you're thinking.
This is Thomas Rupert. I have a comment but I don't want to derail this discussion, so I want to let this finish and then I'll jump in. For me, this is fine.
Okay. Yeah, if we, it sounds like we're good. At this point, we're just going to say of flood risk, put a period. And then we're going to delete the rest of that paragraph there in the sentence. And we'll just strike the rest of that. So all the way down to the end. And we'll take that out. And does anyone have issue right now with taking that part out? And then we'll go on because there are other aspects you want to talk about within this recommendation. Okay,
I'm here for now.
great. Okay,
Agreed.
Thomas, let's go ahead and what is it you would like to take a look at and change?
Well, you know, I do this with some hesitation because I have been on this committee and now I find that I look back at our work and I find that I didn't identify what I think is a significant issue that we didn't address. But again, I feel a little strange bringing it up now so late in the process. But I look more holistically now at the entire process and I see that, you know, we have a subcommittee focused on funding, one on outreach and coordination, one on research, data, and innovation, and then ours on project prioritization. And while all these recommendations that we have are very important and are really good, I come back to my realization at our last in-person meeting, which is none of them really explicitly go towards project prioritization in a sense. They are good. They are relevant to projects, but they don't touch on prioritization per se. And I have been reflecting on that again, and somebody shared with me, actually it was Troy Hartley of Sea Grant, who shared with me some language from Hampton's resilience project, and they have some guiding principles and then some values listed. And I think, is it too late for us as a committee in this process to at least have one of our recommendations try to start going down that road, even if we don't plan on going very far down it for this iteration because of the late hour of the day, so to speak?
And so Thomas, when you can do that when we're wordsmithing today to finalize the wording. If you or anyone sees somewhere where you can finalize that wording to include that directly, right, around project prioritization, you certainly can.
Well, then I will try to look forward a little bit in our recommendations and see if there is any opportunity for that. For the moment, I'm going to throw into the chat just some of the language that has been pulled out of the Hampton resiliency planning process.
Thomas, I was thinking the same thing. And so I was thinking ahead, recommendation E might be the best place to insert some language for that in the framework recommendation.
Thanks, Ian.
Great.
And I would just remind members, we do have guiding principles for flood resilience for the Commonwealth of Virginia, for coastal Virginia, that are outlined in code as well as administrative guiding principles. They are included under each recommendation where we think it is contributing to one of those guiding principles. We have called it out in the worksheet. So I just wanted to draw attention to that as well.
Great.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn. Maybe I should pay more attention to that. If you can show me, if you could share those specifically at some point, that would be very helpful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll try to drop those in the chat now.
Even so, if those are copied and pasted into the chat, you can always refer to it as you go. Okay, so this is good discussion and it's important. The way this looks now, does this sound good to everyone? Are there some other changes that you would make?
I remember in the committee, professionally accepted was questioned, and I can't remember what that the committee decided on.
Pull up that other sheet for you here. Let's take a look. Here it is, bullet number 4. Consider nuance of wordsmithing to include importance of historical context, and consider professionally accepted data versus authoritative data. There's value in historical data, not just forward-looking data. So thinking about that for all of you, when you're, and you can see the recommendation at the top here, just, we obviously shortened it, but just take a look at professionally accepted forward-looking data. Is that how you would like it to be described? There's 3 adjectives there: the scientifically sound, professionally accepted, forward-looking. Is that good? Would you like to shift it? And maybe in talking about it, what is it you're really wanting to say? If you were to say, you know, why do you want to talk about what type of data? What's important?
I mean, I'm assuming that we're all in agreement that we want really good data. The question becomes, how do you evaluate that? And while reality is not subject to our democratic votes on it, we do tend to ascribe to a rather democratic ethos in our society. So I think professionally accepted is kind of a way of essentially voting on the fact that the scientific community agrees this methodology or this data is appropriate. So that's kind of the reason I think I would potentially support that.
Great.
I think I would stick with the professionally accepted.
Okay. Does anyone else, let's go for a third comment. Anybody else want to keep professionally accepted or have another thought?
Going what Thomas said, we want best available data that's actionable, that also integrates current conditions and future conditions.
Best available. Best available. What are your thoughts about best available data? Or does that not cover it enough? Best available. And if you say best available, does that mean you delete scientifically sound, professionally accepted, forward-looking? Or do you combine? What are your thoughts? There's some good things going into the chat there. The guiding principles in Hampton said, use good data.
And the first principle for the Commonwealth is based decision-making on the best available science.
Okay. Best available.
Could you just say consider best available science instead of professionally accepted?
So incorporate best available science into future iterations. So you're not specifically data, but a more general statement. Incorporate best available science. And we can go, but we'll go back to the other recommendation area so you can see what's being changed.
Maybe we should stick with best available science then, just for a sheer consistency perspective, even though I like professionally accepted. Can we argue that best available is determined by what is professionally accepted, or is that open us up to this conundrum that maybe the best available is not yet broadly accepted?
Yeah, that was my thinking, Thomas. Maybe what is best hasn't really been vetted or considered by professionals. So someone with a PhD isn't necessarily going to say we support it, even though from conjecture, historical accounts from, let's say it's native tribes, for example, you know that there is some acceptance out there and some reality that has to be considered. Just because you're a scientist and you can't say it's true doesn't mean it isn't true.
Well, thanks, Scott. Where does that leave us, I guess, then? Sorry, I had to ask that.
Well, that's why I originally was thinking that maybe we should just leave it as the comment best acceptable science or something of that nature.
Okay.
Best acceptable.
So best available or best acceptable?
Yeah, best acceptable or whatever was in the formal language above here, I guess.
I think maybe just for consistency purposes, we should live with that, would maybe be what I'd advocate.
Oh, okay. And
If everyone,
so incorporate best available science. Do you want to leave the forward-looking part, or does best available science cover what you need?
I would get rid of it.
Okay. There you go. So here's your recommendation. The DCR Office of Resilience Planning should incorporate best available science into future iterations of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan for all components of flood risk. Sound pretty good?
My only hesitation with that is we don't want to just be studying the current conditions. We also want to be looking into like how things could change so that we're trying to combat sea level rise, the things that will be impacted. If we build something that only is 2 feet freeboard and we need to have 3 feet, then we've just not spent the appropriate money in the right way when looking forward. Might have been able to do that.
My thinking on that one, Ian, is if we're considering best available science and we're looking at it in the future, then we're going to be considering the best available science in the future. But maybe it's a little too general, but that's just my convoluted thinking.
Would you like to add something like anticipated future conditions, best available science and anticipated future conditions? Anticipated something?
So I know this is going to perhaps take the conversation a little bit of a different direction. I would offer that where this is headed is basically restating the existing codified principles with respect to Coastal Resilience Master Planning for Virginia. And if that's what we want, then I think we're achieving it. If the subcommittee thinks it's more important to call out something else in addition to what's already codified as a guiding principle or offer more specificity into what that means, I think what has happened is we've lost that and we're basically reiterating what is already in code as a guiding principle.
I think you nailed it. And then the question, I think for us is, yeah, which do we want? And I'm curious as to your opinion on that from your perspective, and I'd like to hear other people's opinions too.
My opinion, Thomas?
Yes, yours and that of others.
Okay. Well, I'll just say, I think one of the comments from the TAC was if the current plan is already to this standard, the language should represent, sustaining the standard. I think what was not already to the standard and what Ben was alluding to with his earlier comments is that one, we do not have any kind of forward-looking projections for riverine flooding. We also don't have projections for some other components of flood risk. And some of the data that was removed, such as projected growth, demographic changes, and planned infrastructure improvements, are all not included in our current planning efforts. So if the goal here is to kind of expand what is considered when we look out to future conditions, then I think the previous language was specific in such a way that it called out areas that were not currently included in the plan and speak to kind of almost a different standard or different desired standard for what this plan would include in the future.
So what are your thoughts together as a group about, where would you like to take this? Let's answer that question just in a couple minutes, and then we can move on. to what you want for languaging. And if need be, we can pause, go to the next one, and come back to this. So,
Carolyn, could you be more specific about the language you think that's already written in the plan? Would it be possible for you just to read that out to us?
So the guiding principle, the first codified guiding principle is acknowledge climate change and its consequences and base decision-making on the best available science. What we've got here is the DCR Office of Resilience Planning should incorporate best available science into future iterations of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan for all components of flood risk. So they're obviously not exactly the same, but to me, they read as very similar in terms of what the resulting what the results are.
You wanted to include project prioritization in some way. Do you want to relate this principle to project prioritization in some way? And in that way, take action towards where you're headed with the committee? So where it says it now, so you're incorporating best available science into future iterations of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. Is it something that you're wanting to do to incorporate best available science into project prioritization in some way?
Can you repeat that, please? I think I might like that.
So you would be incorporating best available science into project prioritization in some way. You can decide how. So incorporate best available science for project prioritization into future iterations of the, you have to relate it back to the master plan as well, but.
How about, yeah, incorporate best available science into future iterations of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan to help ensure, to help ensure furtherance of the values, to help support appropriate project prioritization. And then the appropriate there would link it hopefully to if we can come up with some sort of framework or at least suggestions about how to move forward with incorporating values.
Okay.
And data as part of project prioritization.
Okay. So you see how it's written there, and others, if you have an opinion, or you don't have, again, you don't have to wordsmith if you're not sure, but like Kit or Anne or anyone, what do you think about this? Andrew? The DCR Office of Resilience Planning should incorporate best available science into future iterations of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan for all components of flood risk to support appropriate project prioritization. Okay.
Linda, this is Anne. I'm good with that.
Okay, great. Is there anyone else who might?
I'm good with that as well.
Okay. All right, Thomas, do you feel like this says it the way you need to? We'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, I'm good with it, and I look forward to Ian's suggestion about seeing if we can slightly modify E when we get to it. I like it.
Okay.
Are there any members that could not support this recommendation language or want to voice that they're not comfortable with this?
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll go on to the second one. And we can, I think we'll go ahead and screen share what the kind of the information sheet, the Cliff Notes information sheet for discussion that occurred during TAC. And for this one, There were a few comments. There's 5 bullets of comments in here. So I'll read the recommendation. Well, I'll just let you look at the screen for a few minutes. Let's do that. And go ahead and speak whenever you see something. We'll take each point separately to make changes. Okay. So the first point in there, state agencies can't establish funding. Should you rephrase the recommendation? What are your thoughts?
Slightly related to this, when I was reading through the recommendations last night and then comparing it to the objectives of the subcommittee, B's are technically the weakest one, where it doesn't have a direct fit into our priorities and objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And then also knowing that there's a funding subcommittee.
Exactly. That's what occurred to me, Ian, is that there is a funding subcommittee.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to focus on the fact that the funding should connect the Coastal Resilience Master Plan to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, I think that's slightly distinct from the funding. It is more along project prioritization.
Or is it, are you in doing this, so this is the recommendation of the 20 out there that is connecting those two concepts or those two activities. And so if you want to suggest that you take out this recommendation, there won't be another opportunity for it to go back in, I'll say. Unless the funding subcommittee adopts it back in. So are you connecting, when you're connecting these concepts, is by connecting the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, the mechanism for project prioritization? And if so, is that something you want to point out a bit more here?
I am not comfortable enough with my, how do I put this gently? I'm not comfortable enough with my knowledge of all of how these pieces fit together yet to make such a sweeping recommendation. So I'll leave that up to others.
Any other thoughts about this?
Hi, Linda, this is Ann Doyle. My feeling is that these recommendations need to be broad, and I think I would prefer to not to call out the CFPF specifically, because who knows, what's going to happen in the next administrations down the road. I think just say connecting available funds to the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. We know the Coastal Resilience Master Plan is going to remain, but funding streams, are subject to change. So that's my recommendation is don't call it out specifically, and just say funding.
Okay. So in other words, yeah. Instead of and should consider more directly connecting, I guess we can go to the other slide now. So you've seen the suggestions. So state agencies should establish a sustainable and sufficient funding source to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, connecting it to available funds. Where should we put that available funds piece? So we want to delete and should consider more directly connecting to the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. And of course,
So I think, I like Ann's comment But I think maybe what we're trying to get at with this, and I think in my mind, in making this recommendation a while back, was that there needed to be a direct alignment between the funding sources and the master plan. And if we need to kind of make that a little bit more broad than the CFPF, I think that's fine. But maybe something, and we had the concern about whether agencies could establish. So maybe we say something like the Commonwealth should align funding sources directly with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan.
I just wanted to throw out there also that there were a couple of recommendations prior to the full TAC meeting, both from Wetlands Watch and HRPDC, that are in that worksheet for potential revisions to this language that do kind of speak to what you're trying to get at now. So, for example, Wetlands Watch ENU submitted state agencies should establish a sustainable funding source to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan to help implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. I guess that's a little duplicative, but basically just establish a sustainable funding source to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And then Ben, you also had some suggestions, including replacing state agencies with the Commonwealth, that we could take a look at.
Agree with what Ann said. Didn't want to get too specific if funding sources with a specific name were cut.
So does this capture what you're needing? And there's also a HRPDC had language on that page as well. Wetlands Watch and HRPDC. So if you look at that, let's see what take a look at these two suggestions, Wetlands Watch, HRPDC, and then we'll go back to the main recommendation, see if we've captured it.
Ben, could you talk a little bit more about your recommendation there about and sufficient? Just because I'm struggling to understand what do we conceive of as sufficient?
I think where we were coming from with that was that the level of funding should be increased. And so if we're identifying through the master plan effort and other aligned efforts a significant need for funding that outpaces the current level of support, that should be addressed, in terms of how we're actually providing revenue or developing revenue to pay for these things. That's language that we have in our regional legislative agenda when it comes to the funding for resilience improvements. So just to, I guess not beat around the bush, we asked that they put in $200 million a year in the budget. That's what we suggested, and they put in $100 million over 2 years.
Yeah, I really get the idea of significant and increasing. Boy, sufficient is a tough word for me, I guess, just because one, I don't think we can really know what that means.
Do you think something like appropriate level of funding?
That I like, or significant, or progressively increasing. I mean, anything like that, I think is good. I don't know. I just have challenges understanding the idea of sufficient when I don't think I don't know that there is such a thing as enough funding, Ben.
Would sustainable alone be adequate then? Because if you use the word sustainable, you would assume that you have enough to sustain the program.
I guess that I would think that depends on how we define like what the scope of it is, what we're trying to do, right? So if we have, we had until the withdrawal from Reggie, what could be considered a sustainable source of funding. But whether it was enough money to do what we think it should be doing, then that's another question.
How about this as a suggestion? Delete sustainable. So should establish a sufficient funding. Should establish sufficient funding to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, and should put sustainable, should consider sustainable funding to the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And that way, I mean, we're actually looking for a sustainable source of funding, and we want it to be sufficient. Anyway, maybe that's a little, maybe I've muddied the water, but that's my suggestion.
That sounds great. Can you repeat it?
Sure. Should establish sufficient funding, okay, should establish sufficient funding, I guess delete source, to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, and should consider sustainable funding for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. Or
And then we would get rid of available funding there.
yeah. Because there's never available funding.
Okay, so the Commonwealth should establish sufficient funding to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan and should consider sustainable funding for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. Okay, so we could probably combine that. Should establish sufficient funding and a sustainable source of funding to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. So should establish sufficient funding and a sustainable funding source.
Sounds great.
This obviously keeps the word sufficient. So are members comfortable with continuing to include that word, or should we replace it with something else?
I'm not a huge fan, but if everybody else is comfortable with it, I can accept it.
And what part are you not a fan of? Do you know?
The sufficient, the word sufficient. But again, if everybody else is okay with it, that's fine.
And the alternative words you had suggested are escaping me now. Ben, you had said
appropriate is another one we could
Appropriate.
consider.
establish appropriate funding to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan.
You want to make that change? Appropriate instead of sufficient? Or is it like you're saying solid funding? You want to make sure there's funding there, right? So that's another one.
In thinking about other funding streams, I know one phrase that's used is a dedicated source of funding. And that's really what we want. We want a dedicated source of funding that's sufficient to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan.
So instead of sustainable, maybe a dedicated source.
But that's you know, now we're involving the General Assembly and you know, committee work and that kind of thing.
No, I mean, I don't think that there's any reason for us to avoid making recommendations for the General Assembly. I mean, this TAC was, you know, created in legislation by the General Assembly, right? So I think, you know, this idea of having a dedicated, sufficient, and sustainable, or sufficient / appropriate, all three of those to me are important to keep in here. They all mean different things. We have a comment about consistent. Could have lots of adjectives for this, but I think all of these are important to keep. And you know, given you know, with Carolyn's earlier comment about that we're trying to add some specificity to the plan with these recommendations, in addition to what's already in the principles. I don't think we should avoid using too many or several of these words to be very clear about what we're talking about.
Okay, so right now we have we're using sufficient, and here we added a dedicated sustainable source for this funding. So does this work well in this way, or do you want to change sufficient to appropriate or another adjective?
The only and this, I don't know how much more time we have to spend on this, but and maybe this gets to some of Thomas's points earlier, but if the idea is that we are making a recommendation about implementing the plan, then presumably each version of the plan, once we get to a certain point, would have a price tag to it. And so using sufficient to describe that, you say, okay, we have a plan that was going to cost $5 billion to implement, and we're going to assign $5 billion of funding to do that. If the idea is that, and maybe this gets a little bit over into the funding side of things a little bit more, that we're talking about a sufficient or appropriate level of funding for resilience improvements in general in the Commonwealth that includes the master plan, but also things that may or may not be in the master plan that are related to it, then that's a little bit different. But I think this to me is fine. I don't think we really need to get too far. The sufficient versus appropriate. I'm not sure I'm able at this point in time to really wordsmith the difference between those two, but I like dedicated and sustainable. I think removing the CFPF from not calling it out specifically, I am on board with that.
Okay,
I agree with that. Thanks, Ben.
great. Any other changes right now to this recommendation? And if not, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, let's go on to the third one. And I encourage everybody to stretch if you need to, because we've been sitting for a little bit. State agencies should coordinate efforts to develop, maintain, and enhance accessible region-wide non-sensitive data sets needed to assess flood impacts. I think what we'll do, we can move on to the other sheet for this one as well. Let's look at the information that we should be considering based on the TAC meeting for this one. And you can take a look at that, and then we'll come back and wordsmith.
And I just wanted to clarify quickly, the blue coloring on the text on the other screen was to highlight areas where we were using different terminology to refer to similar concepts between recommendations. So in this recommendation, we refer to political subdivisions and academia. In the next recommendation, we refer to local governments and planning district commissions, and I think something like regional institutions of higher education. So those are called out for that reason. There was a general comment about the TAC about using similar language for similar entities.
Okay. And so some of these are concepts, others are wordsmith pieces, which is what we need to work on right now. So before we go back to typing, in short, every state agency has a different definition of regional. So thinking about that word, we have region wide now. And then non-sensitive data sets, if that's something that we need to change. The third point is just a point about data gaps need to be filled to better inform analysis. Is this the role of the CRO? Or should the responsible party be interagency resilience management team or leave it to state agencies? Okay. Let's go on back to typing. And let us know your thoughts. What are your thoughts about this one? Is it saying what it needs to?
I remember in the Q3 full committee, non-sensitive was something we talked about. I had been interpreting it to be non-sensitive in the sense of like Homeland Security. How are other people reading this in the subcommittee?
I read it more so as like, the FEMA repetitive loss data has, folks' names and addresses. I think it's more like de-identified data sets, because there's a lot of data that you just can't access, or are not supposed to share if you do have access to it. So I think I interpreted it as like personal information.
I do want to clarify that there are data sets for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan that we are using that cannot be publicly released, not because of personally identifying information, but because they're sensitive for other reasons. For example, historic resources data down to a specific granularity, we are not able to release because we don't want to broadly share very specific information about where those historic resources are located, because we don't want people to go and disturb those historic resources. So that is one example of a sensitive data set that we're currently using. Ian, your point about Homeland Security, there are also some data sets that can't be released for that purpose.
So I feel like I'm kind of beating the same drum here, but can we just replace accessible region-wide non-sensitive with appropriate or necessary? I mean, I think a lot of those concerns, in some ways, I think calling out things like non-sensitive just kind of raises more questions, and it makes it a little bit kind of confusing, I think, for a lot of people. But and I think, just I think I know why we use the phrase region-wide, but in thinking about where I think we would like to get as a Commonwealth when it comes to being able to assess flood impacts, that a lot of those data sets are going to vary quite a bit from locality to locality. We see that just happening here in Hampton Roads, that we need good H&H data for some localities. We don't need it for others. But I think we would like to be able to have the good data, the data we need for those areas and situations where it's required, but not necessarily across the board.
We change that to appropriate.
I'm saying necessary and appropriate. I don't know if that's duplicative.
Anybody else have thoughts about that? So if you're reading just that first sentence, state agencies should coordinate efforts to develop, maintain, and enhance appropriate data sets needed to assess flood impacts. I guess you've got that needed in there already, so that probably covers the necessary.
I'm good with that.
Thanks, Scott. Okay. We'll move on to that second sentence. Single agency. Oh, and also you're good to have the state agencies as the actor here. A single agency should be identified as the convening entity and should invite participation from, and then you list details in coordination efforts. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's good to have a single entity coordinating things. I'm not sure if we should say who it is or who we think it should be here, but I'm in support of the idea, just not sure if it needs to be more specific to the agency or not.
Do you all know who that single agency should be? Here, the action is to identify them. Is it a single agency should act as the convening entity? Or do you need to start with the identify part?
Is this not kind of the hub and spokes model that we were thinking would be taking place now based on recommendations from last fall?
I think so, Thomas.
And that is referring to the hub and spoke model, just refer to the Chief Resilience Officer and the Interagency Resilience Management Team.
Which, if that's the case, maybe we should change from a single agency to a single entity. As technically the Chief Resilience Officer would not be an agency, would it?
No.
Part of the executive branch.
Mm-hmm. You could also call out the Chief Resilience Officer if that is appropriate.
Mm-hmm. So the Chief Resilience Officer should act as the convening entity and should invite participation from. Because you've already identified them.
I think that makes sense.
I guess maybe we now have an officer as an entity, so maybe we need to shift that language just a little. The chief.
Should invite.
Can you delete what is highlighted there, and will it still keep its meaning? The Chief Resilience Officer should invite participation from? Or should convene and... So in this discussion, you've just established that it would be the CRO. Can we go on to say something, what is it you want the CRO to do? Where's everyone in their thinking process right now? And so now the sentence is now focusing on that verb, right? Should invite participation from. Do you all feel this is good for what you want? Is there anything else you would do to it?
Is should we also add anything about business or commercial interests in there or not?
And right now you have, you've named a few different organizations, let's say, in those coordination efforts. Like you're saying, Thomas, do you want to add more? Or do you want to go the other direction and say should invite participation from others in coordination efforts, leave it general?
Yeah, I think you just hit on what I was kind of hinting at, Linda. Do we want to start listing things because then we may leave somebody out that we want, or do we want to just say that it should be very broad? I think it might, from my perspective, make sense to just emphasize broad participation.
Anyone else have a thought about that? Broad participation, so the Chief Resilience Officer should invite broad participation from others in coordination efforts.
I think that's good.
Okay. So let's highlight that and make that say others. So we'll delete all of the details and say, should invite broad participation from others in coordination efforts.
I think a couple of you do sit also on the Outreach and Coordination Subcommittee. I know one of the terms that we're using there is key stakeholders. I don't know if that's something you all want to consider. Again, just thinking about consistency and terminology across subcommittees.
Even better.
Key stakeholders. And that way the Chief Resilience Officer can choose, or whomever is working with that at the time can choose who is invited.
Just reading this
Question
through,
on
the
that.
first
Go ahead, Ian.
the first sentence is state agencies should coordinate efforts, and then the second is the CRO is going to invite broad participation. Do we want the CRO to also be maintaining that coordination effort of the state agencies? I've seen how it was done when I was working for the state in Texas, where individual teams would go and we were trying to combine all of our data sets into one specific data hub. So the public would be able to search similar terms and come up with different data sets if they were interested in that, for consultants who are working on projects or people who wanted to do groundwater, water supply, or flood planning. So I could see like someone working within that role within the CRO staff of figuring out what data is out there and then bringing it all together so everything's coordinated.
And so Ian, in looking at these two sentences, it sounds like you're wanting the CRO maybe to lead the effort and invite broad participation from, and at the same time, the first sentence, we want to also say state agencies should coordinate. In other words, they're going to listen and want to be part of those things with the CRO.
Yes.
Do you okay. Is it okay? Go ahead.
Oh, Carolyn, can you bring up the code for the CRO?
Sure.
Is it not the CRO's responsibility to coordinate?
So the Code of Virginia specifically calls out that the CRO shall coordinate the collection and dissemination of the best available resilience science, legal guidance, planning strategies, et cetera, to the public. So that's one example of kind of a relevant duty. And then in addition, the Chief Resilience Officer shall convene an interagency resilience management team to support the coordination of planning and implementation of resilience efforts. And the members of that interagency resilience management team are called out as state agencies, and the code lists various state agencies. I did drop a link. I'm happy to share my screen if that's helpful. I also dropped a link to the code in the chat.
And
Thank
so,
you so much.
Carolyn, from what you read there, it sounds like the way this recommendation would differ from that is, in what way? And this mentions state agencies, but it also mentions broader participation, which may not already be in that code. Is that correct?
That is correct. I think the other distinguishing factor here is that this recommendation is focused on data sets needed to assess flood impacts. The Chief Resilience Officer is responsible for all hazards resilience, and I think the specificity of coordinating on data sets for that flood impact assessment is more specific than what is in code for the CRO presently.
Okay. So with code, it sounds like the CRO is already leading the effort, correct?
I think what this effectively does is establish that the Chief Resilience Officer should be responsible also for coordinating efforts specifically to around those data sets for assessing flood impacts.
Okay.
And again, expanding that coordination explicitly to invite broad participation from key stakeholders.
The word coordinate efforts is in the first sentence and in coordination efforts in the second. You could shorten the second to say should lead and invite broad participation, period.
I would suggest, because we have kind of landed this language lands in a place, and if we want to keep it this way, this language lands in a place where we're making a recommendation where one of the primary actors here is the Chief Resilience Officer. With that in mind, I would suggest bringing up the Chief Resilience Officer to the first sentence of the recommendation, just for consistency between the way other recommendations are written. So for example, maybe it could say something like the Chief Resilience Officer should coordinate efforts with state agencies to develop, maintain, et cetera. And that way you've got the responsible party called out from the start so that it's consistent with the way the other recommendations are organized.
I like that, Carolyn.
How is this looking? The Chief Resilience Officer should coordinate state agencies to develop, maintain, and enhance appropriate data sets needed to assess flood impacts. Or are we saying should coordinate state agencies, like apostrophe, efforts to develop? I can read it the way it is now. I know it's hard to see because of would anyone like us to accept track changes at this point? To see it better, or yeah, we can show you the different markup. So it's a lead and invite. We're already saying they're coordinating. Is that okay? The Chief Resilience Officer should invite broad participation from key stakeholders in coordination efforts. Okay. So if we moved on from this recommendation right now, would everyone feel comfortable, or does anyone have anything that they want to say about this, even if you don't know what the change would be?
I think that looks good, or better, because you've got clear responsibility and then there's clear actions that follow. They're coordinating and then they're inviting, with the goal of coordination being the data and the inviting, making sure that all the key stakeholders. I think that looks good.
Thank you,
I'm fine
Sarah.
as well.
Okay. So we're going to move on to D. We have 2 more. State agencies. We can shift over and we will show you the sheet that compiles information on what we talked about at TAC. Here we go. We'll look for a moment. Okay, there's a lot of things listed in here that could be discussed. So when looking at it, there's again, the question about regional. We have the word regional institutions here. What kind of programs are you envisioning with this recommendation? We want priority on high-risk communities to help them. Programs you can keep intentionally broad if you want. The word broad comes up a few times in the suggestions here. Engage a broad range of universities for programs because each of those institutions has its own strengths. And we need to clarify whether established programs would be an active or passive strategy. Do programs include financial assistance? So a lot of questions around this. If it's all right, take any notes you want to. Maybe you have this printed, and we'll go over to actually look at the recommendation and start wordsmithing as needed. There were the revisions here. So what Carolyn mentioned before is just how we are phrasing those different institutions, organizations in blue.
Yeah, because of the changes that were just made to the prior recommendation, there is no longer kind of 2 different terms being used. So you can choose to keep these and it wouldn't be contradictory with anything in the prior recommendation.
So anyone who wants to just dive in with some thoughts. Another point that's come up, I guess in the other subcommittee, the question of, is this specific to the phase 2 master plan, or would this apply to the master plan in general? So does anyone have anything in here that you could not accept?
I mean, I kind of feel like we could actually take out the phrase from with an emphasis all the way to projects or initiatives. I think some of this kind of is implied, and that one, this should last longer than the master plan phase 2 will be kind of in force or relevant, because hopefully we'll have a new plan or a new phase in the next 5 years. And I think some of these programs, I mean, I just don't think it's necessary to keep it in there. But if folks really want to call out these kind of areas, I think we could certainly kind of wordsmith it down a little bit so it's a little less clunky.
Just want to remind everybody the recommendations that we're developing are for actions over the next 1 to 4 years or things that we'll be doing with the next plan update. So we are not, the assumption is not that these recommendations would continue to be in effect after the like when we move on to the next iteration of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, we will probably have new recommendations at that point. So I'm not suggesting one way or another, but just as a reminder on the kind of longevity of the recommendations that you all are developing right now.
Could we just say then with an emphasis on communities with high flood risk?
With an emphasis on communities with high flood risk, or with an emphasis on, it says areas here, with an emphasis on communities with high flood risk, or with. So right now you have that phrase at high flood risk and without flood resilience projects or initiatives. So you're suggesting we change that to say with an emphasis on communities with high flood risk. Do you want to keep the part about without the projects? Go ahead. Do you want to remove the without flood resilience projects or initiatives, or leave that in?
I would get rid of it. I feel like I don't think it's necessary.
Okay.
I think we have communities with identified projects and initiatives that could still stand to get some support. So, I mean, I think a lot of this would just boil down to the discretion or the capacity of the agencies involved. And they would each have their own kind of way to prioritize who they're going to work with, who they can work with.
Okay. State agencies should establish programs to engage with and support local governments and planning district commissions with an emphasis on communities with high flood risk. Involved agencies may include. There you go. Okay. Any other thoughts with this one? All right. So we'll move forward with this one as is. And we have our last big one here. Let's dive into it.
Can I ask, do folks feel like they need a quick break? We could break for 5 minutes and then come back to this recommendation. There are a lot of comments on this one. So I want you all to be ready to dive into this.
And we could take a break. I think our timing is going to be okay if we take a break and we come back at 10:50
or so.
At 10:50, yeah. It's a 6-minute break.
Okay, let's do that. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back together at 10:50 and then dive into this big one here. So see y'all in 5 minutes. Got Jesse, hi.
Give a thumbs up when you're back or turn on your camera. Eli. Great. So let's go ahead again. When you're back, if you want to also, you can also unmute for a moment. What we have here is a recommendation, a lot of discussion in the TAC meeting. And you have the opportunity now to add anything you'd like to around project prioritization into this, make the changes. So let's start. I'm just going to mention each one of these bullets here. and maybe take a few notes for yourselves, and then let's see what we can do to craft it the way you'd like it. So the purpose statement here should be more directly tied to prioritizing action. Okay. Then the next bullet, prioritizing specific projects is difficult. None of the recommendations from this subcommittee lay out specific criteria that could be used. And then who is responsible for deciding priorities at different levels of government? So some of the sub comments around that. Who has the authority and money to fund projects? The plan could be used to help inform the locality's decisions. So local governments are the ones right now with the authority to act and fund projects at the local level. Having the state set the priorities before the localities is seemingly out of order. Prioritization should not be a rushed discussion and should include the CRO once they are in place. Then we went on, it is not possible at this stage in the process to lay out that specific criteria. However, the subcommittee could explicitly state that the Commonwealth should identify criteria as an element of this recommendation and or identify the types of factors to be considered for inclusion in the criteria. So that statement right there is kind of maybe a direct piece of how you could change language. Then, since there's no clear guidance on how one would use the CRMP, we should continue to deliberately avoid specificity in the projects and the prioritization and keep general. The CRMP supports localities with guidance for decision-making. The state's current priority should be to formulate a framework. So you can't pick exactly what to use for prioritization at this point, this quickly, but maybe there's a framework around how to get there. And how do we empower the localities by providing extra support? There's a need to incorporate this guidance. And again, the question someone has asked, do we need to establish detailed metrics? So do you want to speak for a moment collectively, and we'll look at this recommendation about where are you around establishing detailed metrics? What can you say in a recommendation like this to be general enough towards it? Any thoughts about that? And then let's go ahead to the recommendation itself.
I might hazard to jump in here. After looking at the CRMP principles that Carolyn had shared, and looking at that list that I had dropped into the chat from Hampton of both values and principles, there's a lot of overlap between those. And I think those are kind of big picture ideas that don't get into saying these are the exact specifics of which projects should be prioritized, why and how. But I think it can modify this. And I guess my suggestion for modification would be where it says there that the framework should be informed by, I would add a 1 before the data needs assessment, and then 2 principles of the CMRP. So in other words, after assessments, add a 2. Principles of the CRMP and values that represent them. And then 3, would be integrate data/needs assessments with defined values and principles to define success metrics. And then so now it gets into some of the existing language.
So integrating data needs assessment with guiding principles.
Yes.
To define metrics.
Yeah, to define success metrics, and then it goes into and then continue on with the existing language. Because it already says define success and set clear long-term goals.
Okay, so we'll delete that all the way up from and to right before set clear goals. Yeah. Delete the second and we should be okay. Thank you for all these changes. So the framework should be informed by 1, data and needs assessments, 2, principles of CRMP and values that represent them, 3, so making it parallel, the framework should be informed by data, principles.
Well, integrated
data / needs assessment with guiding principles to define success metrics and set clear
or
long-term.
I guess you'd actually, I'm sorry, Linda, you'd probably, to make it consistent like you're doing, which is right, it probably would have to be inverted number 3. The framework should be informed by the success metrics determined through integration of data needs assessment with values.
Success metrics determined through integrated data.
Through integrating data / needs with guiding principles.
Through integrating data, very good, / needs with guiding principles. And so get rid of the word assessment. Or we could say data / needs.
Thomas, would it be, I'm trying to avoid, I feel like we're duplicating some terms here. What do you think about saying something like the framework should integrate data and needs assessments with the principles of the CRMP, principles and values of the CRMP to develop success metrics and set clear long-term goals, ...
Perfect. Good job, Ben. You made it a lot more concise.
It's that UVA education.
Oh, ouch. You got me there.
That's a joke for the record.
I hope so. That's why I'm laughing, Ben.
Values that represent them, period.
Yeah, let's see how we're finishing that. So the framework should integrate data and needs assessments with principles of the CRMP and values that represent them, period.
So with principles and values of the CRMP.
So so with principles and values of the CRMP, period. So we'll make that sentence even shorter.
I just want to clarify that there aren't exactly values of the CRMP right now. There's definitely principles, and
if
sorry,
we've
go
got
ahead, Ben.
principles, then we could just say data and needs assessments with CRMP principles to develop success metrics and set long-term goals.
To develop success metrics and set long-term goals.
Oops, there we go.
That's right. And set long-term goals.
Clear one.
And then the rest can stay as well.
Okay. So should we say clear long-term goals still, or just set long-term goals to be measured on regular near-term time spans? You're assuming that your long-term goals.
I guess the other question might be, do we want to, if we're going to say long-term, we could either, I think, get rid of the phrase long-term, or we could say something like short, mid, and long-term goals. Because I feel like we should have kind of a nested set up.
Okay. So
Especially if we're focusing on things that we're trying to get done in the next 1 to 4 years, right, Carolyn? So if that's the case, then actually having some goals that are going to be completed in that time frame would be worth having. But also keeping an eye on the long game, right?
Thanks for that focus on the time spans, Ben. I like that. And it raises a question. Carolyn, I thought the version of project prioritization that you sent out for this meeting, I thought E was actually a little bit different than what we see on the screen here, because I thought the last phrase was that the framework should define success and set clear goals for a specified time span, comma, while considering long-term costs and investments. So it had some just slightly different language at the end.
Okay.
So that's a good question. There were some iterations of this prior to the full TAC meeting that are included in the worksheet. If we scroll down a little bit there below the TAC recommendations.
On the version I opened, this was in the draft revised recommendation language, the very first paragraph under recommendation E. So I'm just not sure if we're working off of two different, if somehow there's a slight difference between what you sent out and what's on the screen.
Let me double check. If so, that was an error, I believe, but let me double check what the attachment that I sent out.
And so to that end though, let's if there's a piece that's missing that you think is important to be there, if we removed it somehow in error, what should we be putting back in?
Well, it may just need to be left as Ben addressed it, because what I was trying to get to, and I went back and forth with Carolyn on this a while back, is I was trying to integrate some of that potential difference between short, mid, and long-term time span. And so Ben captured that perfectly. The only other thing that I was also trying to capture somewhat is the idea that short and midterm actions can lead to investments, sunk costs, and kind of path dependency for future options. That's why Carol and I ended up going back and forth on it a while, because it's not easy to get in a few words. So we may just have to settle for your language, Ben, being more concise again.
Unless you want a separate sentence after.
I would love to hear if anybody else on the committee considers that important enough to add in or not.
And just before anybody weighs in on it, I do want to clarify the purpose statement that's shown on the right side of the screen here will appear in the plan with the recommendation. We are not going to be voting on that language today, but it will, when these recommendations are presented in the plan, we'll also be sharing the purpose statements that were developed alongside them.
And so that's a great point. Does this purpose statement capture what you wanted to have in here? Like a step one, the main umbrella is a recommendation. The purpose helps explain it a little further.
Not really sure that we mean to use the phrase sunk costs. And so I might, if we're opening up the purpose, I might suggest something like that avoids or minimizes regret and maximizes return on investments.
Minimizes regret and maximizes return on investments.
What's the Thomas, you were working on that thing with Sea Grant, right? Or with the ASFPM, or I'm sorry, the recent thing that you just came out with, the no adverse impacts, was that what it was?
Yes.
So maybe even that minimizes adverse impacts or something like that. I don't know if we want to use the word regret in our master plan.
Actually, I actually was going to say I really liked your wording there, Ben, on because it gets at the idea that we have to be careful that we don't take, I mean, I think considering how short-term investments impact our flexibility to change our approach in the longer term is something that needs to be considered. Because it may very well be, for example, that in many instances, we think that we are going to spend significant amounts on major infrastructure to essentially maintain a status quo in an area. But there may be a realization at some point that may no longer be feasible. And trying to think about that is what I'm trying to get at. And if, you've done a great job with some of the wordsmithing here, if you have a good idea of how to express that succinctly, I would be delighted to see it in here.
Instead of a spelling bee, Ben, it's like a paragraph rewrite bee.
Thesaurus bee. I know minimizes regret maybe isn't a term that's often used, but I know no regret, is a commonly used term when we're talking about climate change and adaptation.
I would say that we should probably change investments to benefits or maximizes long-term benefit.
Maximizes long-term benefit. Okay. Long-term benefit. Right. Now, so we have minimizes adverse impacts. Is that okay to use? Adverse impacts can be visualized when you're thinking about it. Regrets might be more confusing to people.
This is waste.
Yeah, I think, this idea of like the no regrets approach, right? That we don't lock ourselves into a path and we kind of keep our options open. I don't know how to, I'm thinking about how we might phrase that for this. I think keeping it the way it is right now probably could be, would satisfy that.
You could also use maximize. Why? So maximizes long-term benefits. What was the other phrase? Maximizes flexibility and long-term benefits. If that's what you're meaning. If not, we need to change that to regrets. Do you like it the way it's phrased now, or shall we put regrets in there?
I think what you've ended up with is almost kind of a definition of a no regrets approach in a way, without saying no regret.
Okay, so any other changes right now to the purpose? We're okay to leave that this way? And let's, yeah. So on the recommendation itself, let's read it one more time, see if this gets you to where you want to be. The DCR Office of Resilience Planning should work with the Flood Resilience Advisory Committee to establish a coordinated framework to operationalize the Coastal Resilience Master Plan at local, regional, and state scales. The framework should integrate data and needs assessments with Coastal Resilience Master Plan principles to develop success metrics and set clear short, mid, and long-term goals to be measured on regular, near-term timespans. Any thoughts right now?
Is anyone? Oh, go ahead.
Was that Scott? Go ahead,
I
Scott.
don't have any issues with it. I was just saying, I thought it sounded good and as well as the purpose.
Okay. Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I like them both too. One question I have for folks is there was some concern expressed about being too specific or prescriptive in this and keeping more flexibility at the local level. Does setting clear short, mid, and long-term goals do we need the word clear in there, or might that send off alarm bells for those that are concerned about local authority and kind of setting goals at the local level?
So Thomas is asking about the word clear. Does anyone want to remove that or see issue with that?
I don't have any issues with using clear. Yeah, this is of all the things that we've looked at over the year or so that we've been doing this, this one does not trigger my local government authority censor.
I'm fine with clear.
Okay, we'll leave clear. No problem. Okay. Any other changes or comments on this one? There were many comments from the TAC meeting. It seems like you have looked at them for the most part. Does anyone else have anything that should be integrated in here from that? Okay. All right. What we're going to do now is, and we'll do it backwards. So we're going to start with this one for a moment, and then we're going to go backwards and look, is there anything else that we will be changing about either the recommendation or the purpose? In this case, you've just gone over the purpose. You've just gone over this recommendation. Are we good to go? And that would mean that this is the language that we're going to use when we vote. And if you feel, if you're good to go, just say good to go or give a thumbs up. And if you're wanting to change anything, just say, I think we need to change something, and then we'll figure out what to change. Okay, lots of thumbs ups. So let's go on to the fourth recommendation here. And I guess you can make them all the same color at this point. State agencies should establish programs to engage with and support local governments and planning district commissions, with an emphasis on communities with high flood risk. Involved agencies may include DCR, VDEM, and DHCD, and where appropriate, state agencies should involve regional institutions of higher education in engagement efforts. Is everyone comfortable to be able to vote on this? And if not, just say anything. Okay. Thumbs up.
One hesitation with this one, sorry, is that the initial thing we're looking at places that were high flood risk and just didn't have any projects. And remembering how that was an issue in other states, and other states decided to create FTEs to go and sort of like, oh, these communities are under capacity. We are able to do these flood evaluations for you, because there's also like that private consultants probably wouldn't go for it because it just isn't enough money to do it. So the state would take on that. I'm just curious. That was how I was approaching that recommendation before. Does that still get captured? Is that still a worry? What do other subcommittee members think?
Ian, I agree with your perspective on that. And I think that's, we've actually had conversations with DCR about that very concept over the years, to kind of say like, it's providing grants, for example, doesn't really help if you don't even have the capacity to manage a grant or to actively engage with a consultant. And so in some cases, actually having DCR, have a staff person do that work on behalf. I'll say we did not get a very positive a great reaction from the state when we brought that up. There was not a huge amount of interest, but I think that's what I had in mind when I read this, when I think about programs, that's one of the specific ones that I had in mind. I think if we want to add back in what we said, I think the phrase was like no identified projects or programs or initiatives or something, right? So we could,
There's the language the way it was before today.
Without flood resilience projects or initiatives.
Right.
I'm going to put that back in with an emphasis on communities with high flood risk and without flood resilience projects or initiatives.
No, I like that because it's identifying the gap that we could potentially see.
Okay. Okay, anyone opposed to putting that back in? Sound okay? Okay. Great, and does this match the purpose okay? Okay. I will accept no comments as that it's okay. So the way this is, does everyone can vote on this recommendation the way it is, okay? Okay, we're ready to go. Got some thumbs up. Going to the third one. Go ahead and read this to yourselves. I'll read the purpose out loud in a moment. We'll see if there's any changes. If not, we'll accept that this will be what we'll vote on. Okay, recommendation everybody's good with. And purpose, minimize duplication of effort, streamline communications, and effectively mobilize our collective capacity. Great.
I have one quick question on this. I hope it's quick and simple. Is there a definite, Carolyn, you mentioned that key stakeholders is the language used elsewhere. Is there a definition of key stakeholders?
So to clarify, key stakeholders was used in one of the outreach and coordination subcommittee recommendations that they moved ahead to the full TAC for consideration. They met last week. There's not like a code definition of key stakeholders. However, the DCR has a community outreach and engagement plan, which serves as our framework for stakeholder engagement in our flood resilience planning efforts. And that kind of walks through a process by which we would identify key stakeholders for any planning process as part of the process of engaging stakeholders in the planning effort. That could be potentially extended, but I think with the Chief Resilience Officer as the primary party, this will probably be interpreted in a more broad definition of key stakeholders and up for interpretation.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay. So we're going to go on to the next one. The Commonwealth should establish sufficient funding to implement the Coastal Resilience Master Plan and a dedicated sustainable source for this funding. Improve buy-in for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan is the purpose. Any changes, or does this sound good? Okay. Going on to the first one. DCR Office of Resilience Planning should incorporate best available science into future iterations of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan for all components of flood risk to support appropriate project prioritization. The purpose? Enhanced informed decision-making for flood resilience. Enhance informed decision-making for flood resilience. Okay. Is this ready to vote language? And the purpose is okay. All right. We are ready to start the process. But first, I'm turning it over back to Carolyn. And we've got some public participation, public comment.
Thank you. Okay, are there any members of the public at this time who would like to make public comment? If so, please indicate that you would like to make comment in the chat.
No one has indicated they want to speak during the meeting.
Okay. All right, if there are nobody wishing to make public comment, we can go ahead and move on. All right. So at this point, we are going to move on to recommendations voting. So we're going to vote on that recommendation language that we all just looked at and read together. I'm going to talk through the process quickly on how this is going to work, and then we're going to actually move into voting. So for each of these recommendations, we're going to have a process by which the subcommittee chair is going to call for a vote, like we typically do with votes. So a motion and a second. Once the motion and second have been received, we'll ask if there's any discussion on the item before the subcommittee. If there's discussion will commence. If there's no discussion, then we'll move ahead to voting. Voting is going to take place in Mentimeter. So in just a second, I'm going to share a slide, share it now, with a kind of this QR code. You can pull it up on your phone, or you can go to the website and enter the code. And what you'll do is you'll have the option for each of the recommendations to vote yes, no, or abstain. Each voting organizational member of the subcommittee can cast one vote. So I know there's a couple of organizational members here that have two representatives here today. Only one of you should be casting a vote. So please work out with the other who is going to be casting a vote today. And so I think that's Crater BDC is one. There might be others, so just check. So once you've submitted your vote on Mentimeter, what we'll do is we'll then move on to the next recommendation. And as you all are voting, we'll have the final recommendation text pulled up in front of you. Again, we'll go through that process. Jesse will ask for a motion in a second once received, any discussion, and then move forward to the Mentimeter voting. If there is any discussion that does result in the need for additional changes to the recommendation at that point, we will kind of go through that discussion, and then we'll need to revisit the motion in the second and before we move into voting. Are there any questions on this process before we do a couple of practice questions in Mentimeter? Okay, great. So Wheeler and Linda, I will turn it over to you to get folks set up in terms of the Mentimeter side of things.
Great. So you probably want to use your phone. You can use your phone or your computer. It might be easier on your phone. Go ahead and use that QR code. See if you can get into Mentimeter. And once you're in, Wheeler will be able to, Wheeler, you can tell if they're in, right? So we can mention.
We have 3 people. Yeah, we have 3 people that have hit the thumbs up. So we need 5 more to do that. Thumb in the bottom right corner. We have 5 now, looking for 8, 6, 7. 1 more. If anybody's having problems, please speak up.
It's going slow, sorry.
That's okay.
We'll wait. We have plenty of time. It's good.
Okay.
There we go. All 8 have acknowledged that they are in Mentimeter.
Okay. So now we have 2 just sample questions in there. One asks about your favorite flavor of ice cream. Go ahead and answer that ice cream question and then pause. You don't have to do anything, just pause for a moment.
All right. The predominant flavor of this group is chocolate.
Okay. Now go on to the next question, which should be asking in a similar way that when you're voting, it will ask. So Wheeler, what are those three?
It's you'd prefer to have a dog over a cat, and you could support, not support, abstain.
So support, not support, or abstain. And that's how you're going to.
Okay, so there's 4 dog people, 1, I'm assuming not dog person, and 3 that are both dog and cat or something else. So
Okay.
everybody has voted. So I think we've got the process working now.
Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to screen share, because when you're voting in Mentimeter, you're going to be voting on your recommendations A through E, but one at a time. And so Sydney's going to screen share the language on the recommendation. And here you have it. So you're seeing this language. Go ahead and go to the point in Mentimeter where you can vote on recommendation A.
So
we're not there yet.
Okay.
Yeah, we're waiting on them to pick their organization. So we just need to know. We just need one more. Okay, we have everybody has identified their organization.
Okay, great. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse to facilitate us through the motion in a second before we move into voting in Mentimeter.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so we'll start with recommendation A. Is there a motion to recommend this for a vote?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
If there's any other discussion, let's have it now. All right, hearing nothing, I think we're ready to vote.
Okay, great. So hopefully you all are seeing, I don't have the Mentimeter pulled up, but I'm following Wheeler's lead here. So hopefully you all see this as a voting option in Mentimeter. Please cast your vote.
Seeing it yet.
Try refreshing your screen. We have 7 votes in support as of now.
It's definitely me. It says chair call to vote on recommendation.
Okay. Yeah, we've moved to the next slide.
So Ian, if you want to type your vote into the chat, we can record it that way.
Got it. It just updated. Thank you.
Got it. So all 8 have voted in support of recommendation P-A.
Okay, let's move on to the second recommendation B.
All righty, for recommendation B, is there a motion to recommend this for a vote?
So moved.
All righty, a second?
Second.
Second.
All righty, opening for discussion now. All right, I think we're ready to vote.
All members of the group have voted in support of recommendation P-B.
Great, let's move on to recommendation C.
All righty, for recommendation C, is there a motion to recommend this for a vote?
So moved.
All righty, a second?
Second.
All righty, any discussion? Okay, I think we're ready to vote.
All members have voted in support of recommendation P-C.
All righty, moving on to recommendation D, is there a motion to recommend this for vote?
Move to vote.
Okay, and a second?
Second.
All righty, any discussion? All righty, I think we're ready to vote.
All members have voted in support of recommendation P-D.
All right, moving on to recommendation E. Is there a motion to recommend this for a vote?
So moved.
Okay,
Second.
and a second. Oh, okay. Is there any discussion? All right, I think we're ready to vote.
All members have voted in support of recommendation P-E.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. That concludes the voting. All right, so I am going to switch over here and share my screen. We'll quickly discuss some next steps here before we close out. So following this this meeting, we finalized those recommendations and you all voted to move all of them ahead to the final TAC meeting. So what we'll do from the DCR's end is distribute all of the final recommendations from your subcommittee, but also the other subcommittees ahead of that November 13th TAC meeting. So on November 13th, all TAC members will meet again to vote on the final recommendations. This vote is for whether or not the recommendation should be included in the body of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. The process will look very similarly, so each member organization will cast a vote either yes, no, or abstain for each recommendation brought before the committee for consideration, and any recommendation receiving a consensus or majority yes vote will be included in that main body of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. So please do, when you receive the other subcommittees' recommendations ahead of that meeting, please do take a look at them. Make sure you're reviewing them and understand them. Discuss them as needed within your organization before that full TAC meeting so that you're prepared to cast a vote at the meeting. Finally, just a quick look at the calendar. So this is our second of 4 subcommittee meetings. The remaining 2 meetings, research, data, and innovation and funding, will occur this Thursday, October 10th. And then we will, as I've already said, meet again on November 13th ahead of the plan's release at the end of the calendar year. And that is all I've got for you all today. So I just want to thank you all again for your participation in this process and for the effort that you all put in to develop these subcommittee recommendations, but also to help advise us on the development of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And it's development. We're looking forward to its release. And with that, I will turn it back to Jesse to adjourn the meeting.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. I do think this was a great meeting. It was great to sit in and learn a little bit about what you all were doing. So with that, have a great afternoon and the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.